I never thought I'd have to stop a home invasion. But there I was, in my own backyard, staring at a woman wielding a chainsaw like a maniac. She wasn't a burglar. She wasn't some deranged lunatic off the street. No, she was far worse. She was my neighbor, Deborah Wilkins. And she had decided, without my permission, that my 100-year-old oak tree had to go. When Deborah Wilkins moved into the neighborhood, everything changed. Before her arrival, our little community was peaceful. The HOA existed, but it wasn't oppressive. People followed basic guidelines, but there was no one going around measuring grass height with a ruler or issuing fines over mailbox colors. Then she showed up. Within a week, she had already reported multiple neighbors for ridiculous violations. An elderly couple across the street, fined for having one garden gnome that she called tacky and disruptive to the neighborhood's aesthetic. The Johnsons, fined because their trash cans were visible from the street for 20 extra minutes on collection day. And the Smiths? They got hit with a notice because their kids had left a basketball hoop in their driveway. That hoop had been there for 12 years without a single complaint. Deborah didn't care. She walked around the neighborhood like a self-appointed sheriff, clipboard in hand, writing down infractions that only she seemed to notice. If anyone dared to question her, she'd pull out some made-up HOA bylaw and recite it like scripture. And if you didn't comply, you'd wake up to a nasty letter in your mailbox, officially, notifying you that your home was not in compliance with her version of the rules. At first, I kept my head down. My property was well maintained, my lawn was always trimmed, and my house was exactly the way it had always been. If I just ignored her, I figured she'd leave me alone. I was dead wrong. It was a normal Tuesday morning. I was on a work call, deep in discussion, when I heard a strange sound coming from outside. A buzzing noise, loud, mechanical, and getting closer. At first, I ignored it. Probably a neighbor doing yard work. Then the buzzing grew louder and louder. Something about it felt off. I tried to focus on my meeting, but my curiosity got the best of me. I muted my mic, stood up, and peeked out the window. My stomach dropped. There, in my backyard, was Deborah Wilkins, and she was holding a chainsaw. For a second, I just stood there, completely frozen. Was I seeing this right? She had on a pair of bright yellow gloves, oversized sunglasses, and the most casual expression, like she wasn't trespassing on private property, like she wasn't attempting to destroy something that wasn't hers. And then I saw what she was doing. She had already started cutting into the massive trunk of my century-old oak tree, a tree that had stood strong through storms, through years of change, through everything. I slammed my laptop shut and bolted outside. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Deborah didn't even flinch. She turned off the chainsaw and looked at me like I was the one interrupting her. "Oh, Michael, good morning," she said sweetly, as if she wasn't literally about to commit property damage. "Just handling a tree situation." I blinked. "A what?" She motioned toward the tree like it was a piece of junk furniture she was doing me a favor by tossing out. According to HOA Bylaw 47.8, trees over 35 feet are prohibited due to potential storm damage. Yours is at least 40 feet, so I'm just helping by removing it. I stared at her, barely able to process the insanity of what she was saying. "You're cutting down my tree." "Yes. On my property." "Yes," she repeated, her hands on her hips like this was all perfectly reasonable. I let out a slow, deep breath. "Deborah, first of all, that bylaw doesn't exist. I've read every single HOA rule, cover to cover. Second, even if it did exist, you have zero authority to just show up and start cutting down my tree." She tilted her head, smile still plastered on her face. "Oh, but I do." And that's when she dropped the bombshell. "I'm the new HOA president." That was news to me. She must have seen my skepticism, because she kept going. The election was last week. You would have known if you'd attended the meeting. Now, I knew that was a lie. Because I had been at the last meeting. The HOA board had discussed landscaping guidelines, sure, but there hadn't been any elections. Not that it mattered. Even if she was the new president, she still couldn't just walk into someone's yard and start cutting down trees. I folded my arms. Even if that were true, you still have no right to be here. This is trespassing and destruction of property. Her smile wavered for just a second, but then she squared her shoulders. Michael, I know this is difficult for you, but you have to follow the rules like everyone else. This tree is a hazard. Hazard? To who? She rolled her eyes dramatically. To the community. It drops leaves in my yard every fall. I have to rake them. I blinked again. Your house is 3 doors down and across the street. She just huffed. Leaves travel, Michael. I took another step toward her. Put the chainsaw down, now. Her grip tightened on the handle. I've already started, so I might as well finish. The HOA board voted, and we're removing all oversized trees. Yours is just the first. I pulled out my phone. You have exactly 5 seconds to get off my property before I call the cops. Something in my voice must have convinced her that I wasn't bluffing. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she finally set down the chainsaw with a dramatic sigh. Fine, but you will be getting a formal violation notice, and there will be fines, Michael. Daily fines. With that, she picked up her things and marched off my property, her blonde bob bouncing with every furious step. I watched her go, then looked at the fresh cut she had made into my tree. The damage was minimal, but it was enough to make my blood boil. I wasn't going to let this go. Deborah Wilkins had messed with the wrong neighbor. I stood in my yard, heart still racing, staring at the fresh gash in my tree's bark. The chainsaw was gone. The sound of Deborah's angry stomping had faded, but the damage she had done, both to my property and to my trust in humanity, remained. She had just trespassed onto my land, illegally attempted to cut down my tree, and then had the audacity to threaten me with fines. I wasn't about to let this slide. The moment she was out of sight, I pulled up my contact list and called my friend Thomas. Thomas wasn't just any friend. He was a lawyer, specializing in property disputes. And right now, I needed every ounce of legal firepower I could get. Tell me everything, he said as soon as he picked up. I laid it all out for him. The chainsaw, the fake HOA rule, the claim that she was the president, the threats, the complete and utter insanity of it all. When I finally finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Thomas let out a slow, disbelieving whistle. She actually did this? In broad daylight? Yep. She brought a chainsaw onto your property and started cutting. Like a lunatic. He sighed. Michael, this isn't just a minor HOA dispute. This is criminal trespassing and attempted destruction of property. That tree, depending on its size and age, it could be worth thousands. I nodded. I figured. She could be facing felony charges. That caught me off guard. Wait, felony? Mature trees like that can be valued anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the species. If the damage is significant enough, yeah, this is serious. That's all I needed to hear. I grabbed my phone and began taking pictures of the damage, the small but visible cut in the bark, the displaced wood chips at the base, the faint chainsaw marks on the ground. I documented everything. Then I called the police. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Chen arrived about 30 minutes later. They were both no-nonsense types, the kind of officers who had probably seen it all. When I explained what had happened, they exchanged looks. This is definitely trespassing, Rodriguez said, inspecting the tree. And depending on the estimated value of this tree, The attempted damage could push this into felony territory. Chen nodded. We need to assess just how much damage was done. Do you have any security cameras? Not yet, I admitted. But I just ordered some. After this, I gestured to my tree. No way am I leaving my yard unprotected. Rodriguez made a note in his notepad. That's a smart move. People like this tend to escalate. That sent a chill down my spine. Escalate? As in, get worse? I looked toward Deborah's house, 3 doors down. The lights were on. The curtains were drawn. I couldn't see her, but I knew she was inside, watching, waiting. What exactly was she planning next? The officers assured me they would speak to her, but their warnings stuck with me. So as soon as they left, I took another precaution. I emailed the real HOA board. I kept it professional, but I didn't hold back. Subject: urgent HOA violation and trespassing incident. To the HOA board. This morning, Deborah Wilkins trespassed onto my property and attempted to cut down my tree with a chainsaw. She claimed she was acting under HOA bylaws and referred to herself as the HOA president. I have already spoken to law enforcement, who confirmed this is a criminal matter. I am requesting the official HOA meeting, minutes from last week, where she claims this vote took place. I also want written confirmation regarding her actual position within the HOA. This behavior is unacceptable, and I intend to pursue legal action if necessary. Michael, I hit send. Within minutes, my inbox blew up. The actual HOA president, James, replied first. Michael, what the hell is she talking about? There was no vote. Deborah is not the HOA president. She joined the landscaping committee last week. That's it. The next few emails poured in just as quickly. HOA board members expressing confusion, disbelief, even anger. Some of them hadn't even heard about Deborah's tree removal initiative, because obviously, it never existed. By the end of the day, one thing was crystal clear. Deborah wasn't just power-hungry, she was delusional. The next morning, I woke up to find an official-looking letter in my mailbox. A violation notice. I tore it open. Dear homeowner, your property has been found in violation of HOA bylaw 47.8, which prohibits trees exceeding 35 feet in height. You are hereby ordered to remove the tree within 14 days. Failure to comply will result in a $500 fine, increasing by $100 each day thereafter. At the bottom, in giant, ridiculous handwriting, was a signature. Deborah Wilkins, HOA president. She was really doubling down on this lie. I immediately forwarded it to James, who responded almost instantly. Ignore it. She has no authority. We'll handle this. A few hours later, another email came in from James, this one addressed to the entire HOA community. Dear residents, it has come to our attention that a member of the HOA Landscaping Committee has been issuing fraudulent violation notices and falsely claiming to hold a leadership position. We want to clarify that HOA elections are scheduled for November, and at no point has Deborah Wilkins been voted into any executive role. Any violation notices issued by her are invalid. If you receive one, please disregard and notify the board immediately. It was a devastating blow to Deborah's credibility, but the real karma was still on its way. Because just 2 days later, a massive storm rolled in. The kind of storm that makes the windows rattle, that sends garbage cans flying down the street, that turns tree branches into projectiles. I woke up the next morning to my power being out. Curious, I decided to drive around the neighborhood to check on things. That's when I saw it. A crowd had gathered in front of a house. Deborah's house. A massive tree had fallen straight into her roof. And the best part? It wasn't just any tree. It was her tree. The one in her own yard. The one she had refused to remove. despite multiple neighbors warning her that it was dead and rotting. Her actual hazard tree had crashed into her home. The irony was so strong I almost burst out laughing. As I pulled up, I saw Deborah standing on her front lawn, absolutely losing her mind at a firefighter. "This is his fault," she screeched, turning and pointing directly at me. I froze. "What?" "You did this." I let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Deborah, are you actually accusing me of causing a storm?" She didn't hesitate. "I know you reported my tree to the city. They were going to force me to cut it down, and you wanted me to suffer. This is revenge." The firefighter she had been yelling at gave me a look, the kind of look that said, "Wow, this woman is insane." I just crossed my arms. "Deborah, I had no idea your tree was even dead. Maybe if you spent less time trying to destroy other people's property and more time maintaining your own, this wouldn't have happened." And for the first time, Deborah had no comeback, because she knew. She had done this to herself. The scene in front of Deborah's house was pure chaos. Firefighters, paramedics, curious neighbors. Everyone was gathered, staring at the giant tree that had caved in her roof. The front of her house was barely visible behind the mass of broken branches and splintered wood. Rainwater dripped from the gaping hole in her ceiling, and the entire left side of her house looked like it had been punched by nature itself. And there she was, standing in the middle of it all, screaming at anyone who would listen. "This is his fault," she shrieked, pointing directly at me. I had barely stepped out of my car before she started her meltdown. I laughed, an actual laugh, because it was so absurd. "Deborah, are you seriously accusing me of causing a storm?" Her face twisted with rage. "You reported my tree to the city. I know you did. They were going to make me cut it down, and now this happened." She flailed her arms at the mess behind her, as if that proved some grand conspiracy against her. I shook my head. "I had no idea your tree was dead, Deborah, and judging by the fact that it fell on your house, maybe you should have reported it." A few neighbors chuckled. Someone muttered, "Karma." She wasn't having it. "Lies," she screeched. "You refused to cut down your tree even though it was a hazard. And now, look what happened. Look." I shrugged. "Yep, your dead tree fell on your house. Wild how that works, huh?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She had nothing, no comeback, no fake bylaws, just blind, irrational anger. One of the firefighters, who had clearly had enough of her nonsense, stepped forward and held up a hand. "Ma'am, we need you to calm down. Your home has sustained major structural damage. We're going to need to assess the integrity of the rest of the building before you can go inside." That set her off even more. "What? No! I live here. You can't just tell me I can't go in my own home." "Ma'am," the firefighter said, his patience wearing thin, "half of your roof is in your living room. We're not telling you this to inconvenience you. It's not safe." Her eyes darted back to me, as if I was the one giving the orders. "I hope you're happy," she spat. I sighed, shaking my head. "Deborah, I didn't do anything to you. I never reported your tree. I never messed with your house. The only person responsible for this," I pointed straight at her, "is you." I could see the rage boiling beneath her skin, but there was nothing she could say. She knew it. Everyone knew it. I turned to leave. I wasn't about to waste my entire morning standing around while she tried to twist reality to fit her delusions. I had better things to do, like enjoy the sight of karma serving her exactly what she deserved. But as I walked away, I heard her yell one last thing. "This isn't over, Michael. You'll regret this." I didn't know it at the time, but she actually meant it. The next few days were weirdly quiet. No HOA violation notices. No passive-aggressive emails. No angry Deborah stomping up and down the street, looking for something to complain about. For a moment, I thought she had finally learned her lesson. Maybe the damage to her house had humbled her. Maybe she'd realized that she had pushed her luck too far. But no, she was just waiting, planning. And then on a quiet Tuesday night, at 2 a.m., my security cameras caught her. Deborah, in my yard, with a chainsaw. The first thing I noticed was the buzzing. It wasn't as loud as the first time, probably because she was trying to be stealthy, but I knew that sound instantly. And this time, she wasn't just starting to cut. She had already made it halfway through the trunk. I bolted upright in bed. My heart slammed against my ribs as I grabbed my phone and pulled up the security footage. There she was, clear as day, drenched in sweat, hair a wild mess. Her face was twisted with pure determination, like she was on some personal vendetta against this tree. The chainsaw roared as she dug it deeper into the bark. Wood chips flew around her, coating the grass. She was putting her entire body into it, forcing the blade through layer after layer. She was actually trying to finish the job she had started weeks ago. I didn't even hesitate. I dialed 911. The operator picked up immediately. 911, what's your emergency? My neighbor is in my yard with a chainsaw, trying to cut down my tree. Again. The operator was silent for half a second. I'm sorry, again? I didn't have time to explain the entire saga of Deborah Wilkins, HOA dictator and professional lunatic. Yes, again. She trespassed last time. The police already warned her. Now she's back, and she's already done significant damage. That got their attention. Officers are on their way. Stay inside and do not approach her. I wasn't planning on it, because at this point, I wasn't even angry. I was stunned. How far gone did someone have to be to think this was a good idea? 5 minutes later, the flashing lights of a police car lit up my yard. Deborah was so focused on cutting down the tree that she didn't even notice. Not until Officer Rodriguez, the same officer who had warned her last time, stepped out of his car and shouted, "Mom, drop the chainsaw and step away from the tree." The chainsaw stopped. Deborah spun around, wild-eyed, like an animal caught in headlights. And then, she ran. She actually tried to make a break for it. Problem was, she had spent the last half hour wrestling a chainsaw, so she was exhausted. She barely made it 5 steps before her foot caught on a tree root, and she face-planted straight into the grass. Rodriguez and another officer were on her in seconds. "Let me go!" she screamed as they pinned her arms behind her back. "I'm the HOA president. I was just enforcing the rules." Rodriguez looked like he had 0 patience left. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for criminal trespassing, destruction of property, and ignoring a previous police warning." As they hauled her up, she turned to me, rage burning in her eyes. "This is your fault, Michael," she screeched. "You think you've won. You haven't seen the last of me." I just smiled. "Deborah?" I said, tilting my head. She snarled. "What?" I nodded toward my tree, the one she had completely failed to finish cutting down. "You missed a spot." That was the last thing she heard, before they shoved her into the police car and drove her away. I stood in my yard, watching as the police car carrying Deborah Wilkins disappeared down the street, her muffled screams of indignation fading into the night. A strange silence settled over the neighborhood, as if the very air had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. Deborah was gone, arrested, finally facing the consequences of her insane actions. But then, as I turned back toward my house, my eyes landed on my oak tree, and the relief vanished. The damage was bad. The cut she had made was deep, far deeper than last time. Bark was stripped away in jagged chunks, exposing the raw wood underneath. The trunk, which had once stood strong and unshaken for over 100 years, now had a massive, ugly wound carved into its side. I walked up to it slowly, running my hand over the rough grooves left by her chainsaw. And then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A crack. A long, splintering fracture running up the trunk, barely visible in the dim light. I swallowed hard. That wasn't just surface damage. That meant structural weakness. My tree, my century-old tree, might not survive this. A familiar anger bubbled up inside me, but this time it was mixed with something heavier. Loss. Because this wasn't just some tree, it was history. It was shade in the summer, a home for birds, a landmark in the neighborhood. It was mine. And now? It was on the brink of destruction. I needed an expert opinion. So the next morning, I called an arborist. Dr. Patel arrived that afternoon, a no-nonsense woman in a brown work jacket with years of experience written in the lines of her face. She ran her hands over the wound in the trunk, inspected the base, even tapped along the bark like a doctor checking for a heartbeat. Then she stepped back, arms crossed, and let out a heavy sigh. "This tree has been through a lot," she said. "And it's strong. But I won't lie to you. This cut is bad." I felt my stomach tighten. How bad? She hesitated. "Deep enough to make the tree structurally unstable. If a strong storm comes through, it could snap. And even if it doesn't fall, the damage has made it more vulnerable to disease and decay." I already knew what she was going to say next. "I'm sorry," she said gently, "but the safest option is to remove it." I had expected it, but hearing it out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. Dr. Patel must have seen the look on my face because she placed a hand on my shoulder. "Listen, I know losing a tree like this is hard, but if you want, I can connect you with a nursery that specializes in historic tree preservation. They grow saplings from trees just like this one. It wouldn't be the same, but it would be a start." A start. I exhaled slowly, nodding. Yeah, I'd like that." She gave me a small smile. "I'll send you the details." Meanwhile, the aftermath of Deborah's arrest was spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. By noon, everyone knew what had happened. Neighbors who had once tolerated her were now openly celebrating her downfall. People stopped by my house just to shake my hand, as if I had personally defeated the HOA dragon that had tormented them for months. Then came the HOA meeting. James, the actual president, called an emergency session to formally remove Deborah from any position of influence, including her spot on the landscaping committee. He also made it clear that any fines or violation notices issued by her were void. And, in what was possibly the best moment of the entire meeting, someone suggested that from now on, any changes to HOA rules be put to a community vote. James agreed. Deborah had tried to tighten her grip on the neighborhood, but all she had done was make everyone realize how much they hated HOA dictatorship. Her legacy was destroyed, and she had nobody to blame but herself. A week later, my tree was removed. It was painful to watch. The crew took every precaution to bring it down carefully, cutting it into large sections, preserving as much as they could. By the end of the day, all that remained was a stump, a wide circle of sawdust, and a void where something ancient had once stood. But something strange happened as the tree came down. Neighbors started gathering, not just to watch, but to help. Elena, the woman who lived next door, brought over fresh lemonade and cookies. Mr. Patterson, the elderly man from 2 houses down, offered to help plant a new garden where the tree had stood. Parents brought their kids over, letting them collect acorns from the fallen branches. By the time the last piece of wood was hauled away, it didn't feel like a loss anymore. It felt like a rebirth. And then, as if karma wasn't done with Deborah yet, her house went up for sale. Apparently, after her arrest, she couldn't afford the legal fees, the HOA fines, the real ones from her actual violations, and the repairs from her fallen tree. She was forced to sell. When I saw the for sale sign go up in her yard, I laughed. Her reign of terror had lasted just a few months, but her downfall, it was absolute. 4 months later, on a bright autumn morning, a group of us gathered in my backyard. Dr. Patel had come through. She had found a nursery that specialized in historically significant trees, and they had given me a 15-year-old white oak, grown from the acorns of a tree very similar to mine. It wasn't as tall, it wasn't as wide, but it was alive. We planted it together. Elena brought out a little plaque that read, "For the oak that stood tall, and for the new one that will stand taller." We all stood around, glasses raised, toasting to new beginnings. And as I looked around at my neighbors, real neighbors, people who had come together to support one another, I realized something. Deborah had tried to destroy something good. She had tried to cut down my tree. She had tried to divide the neighborhood. She had tried to turn everyone against each other. And in the end, all she had done was make us stronger. So, as the sun set over my new tree, I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in months. Because in the end, karma had done its job.